most peculiar kind of phenomenal being. Reflections on Martin Heidegger's Dasein und Zeit, Section 16, by Dennis Matthews, October 2023. Sukes perata ion uk an exuroio pasan, epiporu omenos hodon, huto bathon logon eke. Heraclitus, Fragment B45. You will not find out the limits of the soul when you go, traveling on every road, so deep a logos does it have. Hello, welcome to this video presentation of an essay I originally drafted in October of 2019. I was a member of a study group reading Martin Heidegger's Dasein und Zeit, or Being and Time. This essay is my reflections on Section 16 of that work. The title of Section 16, as translated by Macquarie and Robinson, is, quote, how the worldly character of the environment announces itself in entities within the world, unquote. That's a rather daunting title. You might even call that a Heideggerian mouthful, but no worries. I mention it here as the reference for those who want to go back and read the primary text for themselves. I wrote the essay as a philosophical exercise for myself and the other members of the study group. This video essay, however, is a different medium for a different audience, and as I've come to discover, an entirely different challenge. Heidegger is notoriously jargon-heavy, a fact that is impossible to circumvent. In fact, there is a valid claim that it's impossible to fully grasp what Heidegger is saying in a translation. His use of the German language, the subtle shifts and nuances of meaning, as well as his propensity to invent neologisms, that is, invent new terms to match his new ways of thinking and original descriptions of phenomena, put his thought beyond the reach of the non-German speakers. That's discouraging and a bit condescending, but so be it. We cannot circumvent our own facticity, and so we will just carry on. I will introduce and discuss some of the German terms and their translations, knowing full well that whatever I present here is necessarily inadequate, but that's okay. The point is to extend the meaning of these concepts and enrich the ground on which to think. Now, for those watching who are not familiar with the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, Dasein und Zeit is a masterwork of existential philosophy published in 1927. Echoing Nietzsche, Heidegger philosophizes with a hammer, striking and sounding out the hollowness of 2,500 years of philosophical thinking, resolutely tolling out the end of the Western metaphysical tradition. Dasein und Zeit, being and time. We will encounter variations of this German word sein, meaning being, or to be, throughout this essay. You may already be familiar with the German word Zeit, meaning time. Zeitgeist, for instance, is a German word which has been incorporated into the English language and is usually translated as spirit of the times. In this original and brilliant piece of phenomenological description, Heidegger begins his exploration with what he calls the Seinsfrage. Fragen is the German verb meaning to question. Seinsfrage is the being question. What is the meaning of being? Have you ever asked yourself the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Have you ever felt the power, the wonder, and the profound mystery of this most intractable of all questions? In that singular moment of questioning, you are a philosopher and stand alongside Heidegger on the same philosophical ground. In a lecture from 1935 at the University of Freiburg, Heidegger writes, this question may, quote, merely pass through our lives like a gust of wind. It may press hard upon us, or under one pretext or another, we may thrust it away from us and silence it, unquote. Mere mortals like you and I, we may touch on this disconcerting question, but we quickly abandon this ground and gladly return to our everyday concerns. Heidegger, however, is stronger than most and lingers here with the question of being. With the publication of Dasein und Zeit, this question stands out in fresh and original relief against the background of that old and venerable philosophical tradition. Heidegger carries us back to the ancient Greeks, the arche of thinking, and the initial transcendence of thought, that first encounters and questions the meaning of being. This profound, creative, and intellectually demanding text, like Heidegger himself, is not without controversy and detractors. Regardless of its merits and deficiencies, the philosophical tradition has been forced to engage with this dense and recalcitrant work and re-engage with the question of being. I first encountered Sein und Zeit as a graduate student at the University of Kentucky while studying phenomenology in the mid-1970s. This text is an intellectual bombshell that completely disrupts the way we think about the world. Sein und Zeit is just the kind of work every graduate student in philosophy should be confronted with. Do not expect a YouTube video to answer the question of the meaning of being. The purpose of this essay is quite modest and personal. I have discovered that as one grows old, as some of us do, that philosophy and the call of philosophy transforms with age and emerges not as a search for ultimate answers, which is itself originally grounded in practicality, but as the ground for thinking and creative self-expression. This video essay is my reflections, drawing from the language of Heidegger's text to develop and express my own philosophical thinking. It is necessary to introduce and highlight some of the German terms in the text. The first of these is the German word Dasein. Dasein is a compound word made up of da, there, and sein, being there. In everyday German vernacular, it means existence, and in particular, human existence. In other words, you and I, we are Dasein. Dasein is the kind of being which is human being. This German word, which carries so much weight in the text, is always preserved and never translated. Dasein, Heidegger says, which ought to be the most familiar to itself because it is closest to itself, mischaracterize its own being in terms of its understanding of entities in the world. What do I mean by this? Take as an example the question of free will, while noting that the purpose of this example is not to litigate this question. Determinism is the philosophical view that all events, including human choices, are in fact caused by some antecedent event or state and fully determined by the laws of nature. This view understands human beings in terms of the mechanistic, spatio-temporal entities of nature, but according to Heidegger, this is a category mistake that overlooks and therefore misses the peculiar kind of being that is Dasein. Sein und Zeit, which raises the question of being, sets for itself the initial and preparatory task of uncovering and making transparent this most peculiar kind of phenomenal being. In section 16 of Sein und Zeit, Heidegger provides the first concrete description of the existential life of Dasein with the introduction of three new terms: conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy. He begins the existential analytic by showing that Dasein, in its everyday, ontic, unarticulated, and pre-ontological understanding of the world, can and does encounter what he calls the worldly character of the world. Conspicuousness is Macquarie and Robinson's translation of Heidegger's term Auffälligkeit. The German prefix auf has several different meanings, including on, up, or to open, as in to open up. Auffälligkeit is derived from the German word fallen, which means to fall. Auffallen means to fall on or fall open, for something to suddenly announce its presence and simply stand there in front of you. Obtrusiveness is the translation of Aufdringlichkeit. This word has etymological roots with the German word zwingen, which means to be forced. In the game of chess, for instance, an opponent can place you in Zugzwang, a position where any legal move is a bad move and simply makes the position worse. A debilitating moment for every chess player from beginner to grandmaster. Aufdringlichkeit is to have something forced on you. Obstinacy is the translation for Aufsässigkeit. Aufsässigkeit means not only obstinate in the sense of recalcitrant, but also rebellious, defiant, and non-compliant. If you have a 2-year-old, you may know what I mean. Unlike Auffälligkeit and Aufdringlichkeit, which are passive, something falls open in front of you or is forced upon you, Aufsässigkeit describes something actively opposed to your will. We want to examine these three concepts of conspicuousness, Auffälligkeit, obtrusiveness, Aufdringlichkeit, and obstinacy, Aufsässigkeit, in terms of the average everydayness of Dasein. Heidegger calls average everydayness a, quote, peculiar phenomenal domain, unquote. This peculiar domain is revealed by the unique way conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy announce themselves. They provide a first glimpse of the peculiar kind of being that is Dasein, that is, the being of ourselves, and how we as Dasein experience ourselves and encounter the world. Average everydayness, durchschnittliche Alltäglichkeit. Durchschnittliche is a compound word. Durch means through, and Schnitt means to cut. Average is the cut-through of everydayness. Heidegger often uses the phrase zunächst and zumeist, proximally and for the most part, to describe average everydayness and how Dasein, always and for the most part, comports itself towards the world. In its average everyday concern for the world, Dasein looks beyond itself and fails to see itself. Quote, what is ontically closest and most familiar is what is ontologically furthest, unknown, and constantly overlooked in its ontological meaning, unquote. This is somewhat analogous to glasses, which are transparent, even though they sit directly in front of the eyes. To overcome this transparency, Heidegger invites us not so much to reflect on the life of Dasein, which, as we have noted, leads to a mischaracterization of the kind of being of Dasein, but instead to remember, that is, phenomenologically describe how Dasein experiences the world. This is difficult to do precisely because one cannot remember what has been overlooked. This transparency contributes to the peculiar nature of Dasein. Heidegger uses the German word eigenartig. Eigen means own, as in Dasein's own. Artig, from the root German word for kind, eigenartig means Dasein is its own kind of being. The shadow of forgetfulness hangs over our average everydayness, our durchschnittliche Alltäglichkeit. Heidegger's phenomenological existential analytic pierces the transparency of everydayness by uncovering the life of Dasein, disclosing it, and allowing it to show itself as itself. Transparency is not easy to see. Fortunately, Heidegger provides examples of everydayness that stand out, grab our attention, and disrupt transparency. Conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy are the result of disruptions in our average everydayness. These disruptions vary in intensity. They may be benign, somewhat annoying, aggravating, frustrating, but they can also be devastating and horrific in their consequences. They are familiar and not at all uncommon events that can happen to anyone at any time. Shoelaces snap, pencil points break, keys go missing, traffic stands in the way, power goes out, plumbing leaks, hurricanes hit, houses flood, people die. As such, these disruptions are ideal as introductions to the life of Dasein precisely because they emerge out of the transparency of average everydayness by suddenly announcing themselves. Unlike transparency, they are easy to see. These ontological events are not themselves existentialia, that is, constitutive of the structure of Dasein, but rather show themselves within the life of Dasein as possibilities grounded in that structure. As ontological events, these disruptions are not merely accidental happenings of surrounding events, but rather they are events grounded in that peculiar kind of being that is Dasein itself. While these events may seem random as Dasein goes about its everyday life, they come to show themselves as pervasive in Dasein's obsessive diligence to prevent them in the future. With this, we have the very first hint of the kind of being that is Dasein. Dasein is the kind of being that can be disrupted. Therefore, Dasein is the kind of being confronted always with the possibility of disruption. These three concepts of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy bleed into one another and show themselves as the result of the same fundamental type of ontological event, a disruption or negative moment in the life of Dasein. Dasein is not the only mode or kind of being, there are others. Heidegger famously identifies and explores two modes of being, or eigenartigen, of entities in the world. Here again we have a compound word, Sein, which is being, and Arten, that's a plural meaning kinds or modes of being. This is the same root word for kind that we found in eigenartig, which means own kind. The two modes of being that Heidegger identifies are zu handen sein, being ready to hand, the being of a tool, for instance. Heidegger famously uses the example of a hammer, which is ready for use and taken up as part of the project of Dasein, and vorhanden sein, being present at hand, the existence of a thing as a neutral object that has no value, precisely because it is just an inert thing. The German prefix vor means before or in front of, as present and standing before you. This is the way we might normally think of things in the world, as stuff that we encounter and then add value to. Heidegger, however, calls that a derived and deficient mode of being. Zu handen sein, being ready to hand, is a prior, more primordial, and originary experience of things in the world. When I see a ladder, for instance, I see a tool for use in a work project, and not just a piece of aluminum. The tools in the carpenter's workshop, the hammer, the chisel, the planer, and the handsaw, along with all the other tools, hang together, zusammenhängen, and are coherently understood in terms of each other and the project in which Dasein concerns itself. Conspicuousness is the discovery of the unusability of a tool that is broken and no longer ready to hand. As broken, the tool announces itself as mere object, that is, it has no use, and shows itself in the mode of present at hand. The broken tool becomes conspicuous against the background of all these other entities that are ready to hand, making them inert, present at hand, and of no use. They take on the character of obtrusiveness, meaning they cannot be budged. When the keys go missing, the car stands there as something unready to hand. As that which cannot be budged, it stands in the way and takes on the character of obstinacy. All of those entities in my environment that were previously ready to hand or deprived of their usefulness take on the character of merely present at hand and become nothing to the project that is Dasein. Everything is put on hold until Dasein deals with what now stands in the way. As a type, these disruptive and negative moments render the world empty of use. The character of entities within the world become deprived of their being as ready to hand. As helpless and deficient modes of concern, they uncover the quote, being just present at hand and no more of something ready to hand, unquote. What kind of being is Dasein, such that it can be confronted with this kind of nothingness? Heidegger points to the temporal nature of Dasein, which is revealed by these disruptions. Quote, when equipment cannot be used, this implies that the constitutive assignment of the in order to a towards this has been disturbed, unquote. Dasein, as ontologically temporal, is not just here and now, but also always ahead of itself, striving toward its future self, laying the groundwork in advance. The temporality of Dasein is the ground for the possibility of these disruptions. That is, the reason why Dasein is confronted always with the possibility of disruption. The in order to and the towards this, in which Dasein is always engaged, can therefore always be disrupted. Conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy result from the disruptions of the temporal flow of Dasein. As such, they draw our attention to average everydayness as phenomenologically described and tell us something important about the kind of being that is Dasein. Dasein is ontologically temporal. While this is only an indication of the kind of being that is Dasein, remember we are only here in section 16, so there is much more of the existential analytic yet to come. The language Heidegger deploys to describe the temporal life of Dasein as disrupted is enigmatic and intriguing. He uses words like hidden, uncovered, revealed, transparent, disclosed, lit up, forgotten, visible, shows, and withdraws. These characterizations of Dasein's encounter with being unfold temporally like an ontological drama, as both the world and the entities within the world are either revealed or hidden, made visible, or become transparent again. Intentionality is a core concept of phenomenology, a philosophical method and movement inaugurated by the German philosopher Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century. Heidegger was a student of Husserl. He became Husserl's assistant and later a friend and colleague until the relationship was disrupted on philosophical and political grounds. Sein und Zeit is a thoroughgoing work of phenomenology. Heidegger dedicated the work to Husserl and presented it to him as a gift on his 67th birthday in 1926. The German word intentionalität is easy to translate because it is a cognate, intentionality, but it is not easy to grasp. The standard definition, that consciousness is always consciousness of something, while correct in and of itself, rings hollow because it is not understood within the context of the phenomenological attitude and the task of phenomenology as intentional analysis. Heidegger expresses intentionality existentially as Dasein's relating to or comportment with entities in the world, sich verhalten. For our purposes, to intend is to mean something, and an intentional shift is a meaning shift from one mode of being to another mode of being, a shift from Zuhandensein to Vorhandensein, from ready to hand to present at hand. Phenomenologically, the shifting of these meanings, the positing of being from the ready to hand to the present at hand, is an intentional shift, a new kind of doxic positing. What was ready to hand is now intended in a brand new way. At the same time, the ready to hand is covered over and now meant or intended as unready to hand. Each disruption carries with it this negative moment of not being the ready to hand of what was originally intended. These disruptions are Dasein's encounter with not being, resulting in the nothingness of the ready to hand, which was originally intended in average everydayness. Because these disruptions are grounded in Dasein's own ontological temporality, and because disruptions are encounters with nothingness, nothingness is therefore ontologically grounded in Dasein itself. Jean-Paul Sartre, the 20th century French phenomenological existential philosopher, a student of the works of both Husserl and Heidegger, is keenly aware of these kinds of negative moments. In Being and Nothingness, he broadens and extends the concept to include a wider variety of phenomena which are experienced in our everyday lives. I will not try to pronounce the French. It is a neologism with no equivalent term in English. We'll just call it negativities. It is important to note that these negativities or negations are personal encounters that Dasein experiences in our everyday lives. Examples of these negativities include distance, absence, change, otherness, repulsion, regret, and distraction. They are always present as possibilities for Dasein. In a particularly vivid account, Sartre describes looking for his friend Pierre in a busy Parisian cafe. Let's add an element to heighten the urgency of the situation. Let's assume that Sartre is not there for a casual lunch with his friend, but that he is desperate to find him. That it is a matter of life and death. He writes, quote, "It is certain that the cafe by itself, with its patrons, its tables, its booths, its mirrors, its lights, its smoky atmosphere, and the sounds of voices, rattling saucers, and footsteps which fill it, the cafe is a fullness of being," unquote. And yet all of this is reduced to nothing, as the cafe is swallowed up in the necessary, neutral, and empty background from which Pierre as foreground is meant to appear, from which Pierre must appear. And when he is not there, the cafe, in all of its being, falls open before him as conspicuous, obtrusive, and obstinate in its emptiness. Nothingness, Sartre intoned solemnly, lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm. Conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy are instances of these negativities, and together they disclose Dasein as a peculiar kind of temporal being, like a flickering flame buffeted by a gust of wind that dwells always in the interplay of being and nothingness. Fire will surely come one day to cleanse the earth. Fire will surely come one day to make mine ash. Fate is a fiery tongue that eats up earth and sky. The womb of life is fire, and fire the last tomb. And there, between two lofty flames, we dance and weep.